Hello, my friends. Welcome back to English Unleashed. Today, you will listen to a beautiful story. The story is called The Selfish Giant. It was written by Oscar Wilde. A giant is a person in a story who is much bigger and taller than an ordinary person. This story is about a giant who owns a beautiful garden. At first, he does not want anyone else to use it. He is selfish. A selfish person thinks mainly about themselves and does not like sharing with other people. However, the giant slowly understands that sharing his garden can make both him and the children happy. There was once a giant who had a very beautiful garden. The garden was large and full of green grass. Colorful flowers grew everywhere, and 12 peach trees stood around the garden. In spring, the trees were covered with small pink and white flowers. In summer, their leaves were bright green. In autumn, the trees gave sweet fruit. Many birds lived in the garden. They sat on the branches of the trees and sang beautiful songs. A branch is one of the long parts of a tree that grows out from its main body. The songs of the birds were so lovely that people sometimes stopped walking to listen to them. Every afternoon, after school finished, the local children came to the giant's garden. They ran across the soft grass and played under the trees. Some children climbed the trees. Others sat under the branches and talked together. The children loved the garden. They thought it was the most beautiful place in the world. The giant was not living at home at that time. He had gone to visit one of his friends. He stayed with his friend for 7 years. During those 7 years, the children continued to play in the garden. They did not damage anything. They only played, laughed, and enjoyed being together. One day, the giant decided to return home. When he arrived, he heard voices and laughter in the garden. He walked outside and saw the children playing on the grass. Some children were climbing the trees, and some were listening to the birds. The giant became very angry. He believed that the garden belonged only to him. He did not want the children to enjoy it. He shouted at them and asked why they were in his garden. The children became frightened. They stopped playing and looked at the giant. The giant told them to leave immediately. His voice was loud and his face looked angry. The children quickly ran away. The giant decided that he had to stop them from returning. He built a high wall around the garden. A wall is a strong structure made of stone or bricks that separates one place from another. The wall was so high that the children could not climb over it. The giant also put a notice near the entrance. It said that people were not allowed to enter. The giant was pleased. He thought that now he could enjoy his garden alone. But the children were very sad. They had nowhere pleasant to play. They tried to play on the road, but the road was hard and full of stones. It was not safe. And there was no soft grass or shade. They missed the green grass, the beautiful flowers, the sweet fruit, and the singing birds. Soon, winter came. Snow covered the houses, streets, and gardens. The weather became cold, and the trees lost their leaves. After several months, winter ended. Spring arrived in the rest of the country. Green leaves began to grow on the trees. Flowers came out of the ground, and birds started to sing again. However, spring did not come to the giant's garden. Inside the high wall, the ground was still covered with snow. The trees had no leaves, and no flowers appeared. The garden stayed cold and empty. A cold north wind came to the garden too. It blew between the trees every day and made loud sounds around the giant's house. Then a strong storm arrived. It hit the windows and the roof of the house. The weather inside the garden became worse and worse. The giant sat inside and looked out of his window. He could not understand why spring was so late. He believed the weather would soon become warm. However, the days passed and nothing changed. Spring did not come. Summer did not come sufficiently. In autumn, other gardens were full of fruit, but the trees in the giant's garden gave him nothing. The garden stayed cold through every season. The giant did not understand that his garden was cold because there were no children inside it. Without their laughter and happiness, the garden had lost its life. One morning, the giant was lying in bed when he heard a beautiful sound outside. The sound was sweet and gentle. It made him feel calm. Then he realized that it was a small bird singing in his garden. The giant had not heard birds singing for a very long time. To him, it sounded like the most beautiful music in the world. At the same time, the cold wind stopped blowing. The storm became quiet, and a lovely smell came through the open window. The giant thought that spring had finally returned. He quickly got out of bed and looked outside. He saw an amazing sight. The children had found a small hole in the wall. They had climbed through it and entered the garden. There was a child sitting in almost every tree. The birds flew between the trees and sang with happiness. Small flowers came out of the ground. Almost the whole garden was green, warm, and full of life again. But one corner of the garden was still cold. In that corner, there was a very small boy. He was standing under a tree and trying to climb it. The lowest branch was too high for him. He reached up with his hands, but he could not touch it. The boy walked around the tree and cried. The tree was still covered with snow and ice. The cold wind continued to blow around it. The tree wanted to help the little boy. It moved its branches as low as possible, but the child was still too small. The giant watched the little boy from his window. For the first time, the giant began to understand what he had done. He realized that spring had not come to the garden because he had sent the children away. He understood that he had been selfish and unkind. He had kept the garden for himself, but without the children, the garden had become cold and empty. The giant felt sorry. He decided to go outside and help the little boy. Then he would break down the wall and allow all the children to play in the garden. The giant quietly walked downstairs. He opened the front door and stepped into the garden. When the children saw him, they remembered how angry he had been before. They became afraid and ran away through the hole in the wall. As soon as the children left, the garden became cold again, and the north wind began to blow. However, the little boy did not run away. His eyes were full of tears. The giant slowly walked over to him. He did not want to frighten the child. The giant gently picked up the little boy and placed him in the tree. At once, the tree changed. The snow and ice disappeared. Green leaves grew on its branches and beautiful flowers opened. Birds came and began to sing. The little boy was very happy. He put his arms around the giant's neck and kissed him. The other children were watching from outside the garden. When they saw the giant helping the little boy, they understood that he was no longer angry. They ran back into the garden. As soon as they returned, spring came back with them. The whole garden became warm and beautiful again. The giant smiled at the children. He told them that the garden belonged to them too. He said they could come and play there every day. Then, the giant took a large tool and broke down the wall. Later that morning, people walked past the garden on their way to work. They were surprised to see the giant playing happily with the children. The garden looked more beautiful than ever. It was full of green trees, colorful flowers, singing birds, and laughing children. From that day, the giant was no longer selfish. Every afternoon, when school finished, the children came to his garden. The giant loved watching them play. He listened to their laughter and helped them climb the trees. Their happiness made him happy too. However, the giant often looked for the small boy he had helped. He loved the little boy because the child had kissed him and helped him understand his mistake. The giant asked the other children where the small boy lived. The children did not know. They said they had never seen him before that morning. The giant hoped the little boy would return. Every afternoon, he looked around the garden, but the boy did not come back. Many years passed. The giant grew old and weak. He could no longer run or play with the children. He often sat in a large chair under one of the trees and watched them. He smiled as they played on the grass and climbed the trees. The giant still loved his flowers, but he now understood that the children were more important. Without the children, the garden had been beautiful but empty. With them, it was full of life, love, and friendship. One winter morning, the giant woke up and looked out of his window. The garden was covered with snow. The trees were white and the air was very cold. The giant was not sad because he knew that winter was only resting. He knew that spring would return later. Then he noticed something surprising in one corner of the garden. One tree was covered with beautiful white flowers. Its branches looked golden and silver fruit was hanging from them. Under the tree stood the little boy. The giant was full of joy. He had waited many years to see the child again. Although the giant was now old and weak, he quickly went downstairs and walked into the garden. He moved across the grass as fast as he could. When he came close to the little boy, he suddenly stopped. He saw marks on the child's hands and feet. The marks looked like small wounds. A wound is a place on the body where the skin has been hurt or cut. The giant became angry. He thought somebody had hurt the boy. He wanted to know who had done it. But the child told him not to be angry. The marks were signs of love. The giant did not fully understand what the child meant. The little boy reminded the giant that many years before, the giant had allowed him to play in his garden. Now the child had returned to take the giant to another garden. This new garden was a peaceful place. Peaceful means quiet, calm, and free from fear or pain. Later that afternoon, the children came to the garden after school. They found the giant lying peacefully under the tree. His body was covered with beautiful white flowers. The giant had left the cold winter garden and gone with the little boy to a place of peace. The children never forgot the giant. They remembered that he had once been selfish, but he had understood his mistake and changed. He had broken down the wall around his garden. More and importantly, he had also broken down the wall around his heart. The selfish giant teaches us that we cannot find real happiness by keeping everything for ourselves. The giant owned a beautiful garden, but he was lonely when he refused to share it. The garden became cold and empty because there was no happiness inside it. When the children returned, spring came back. Their laughter brought warmth and life into the garden. The story also teaches us that people can change. The giant made a bad choice, but he later understood that he had been wrong. He did not only say that he was sorry, he showed that he was sorry through his actions. He broke down the wall and welcomed the children. Kindness can bring warmth into cold places. Sharing can turn loneliness into friendship. When we open our hearts to other people, we often receive more happiness than we give. Thank you for listening to The Selfish Giant. Now think about the main message of the story. Real happiness does not come from keeping everything for yourself. It comes from love, kindness, friendship, and sharing what you have with others.